Hey everyone, welcome to the sermon study for the week of March 5th, 2017. This week I had the opportunity to preach on Philippians 4, 6, and 7. As we review the message, let's start by reminding ourselves of that text. It says, "Don't worry about anything. Instead, pray about everything. Tell God what you need and thank Him for all He has done. Then you will experience God's peace, which exceeds anything we can understand. His peace will guard your hearts and minds as you live in Christ Jesus." Now, this sermon was all about worry, and the main point of the sermon was that worry is about self-sufficiency, but peace is about Christ's sufficiency. Worry is toxic to our souls. In fact, it's probably one of the most prevalent sins around. We talked about how self-sufficient the culture of Philippi was. And we've talked about this a lot now, so we don't need to dig into that again here. But just remember that the Philippians were used to a very competitive, honor-driven culture. In fact, today we even have archaeological evidence of families that were competing for honor with each other by constructing these giant monuments to themselves. It was like the very definition of self-sufficient. And so Paul was asking the Philippians to make kind of an unprecedented shift. They were raised to be self-sufficient, these people, but Paul is telling them to be Christ-sufficient instead. Why? Because Paul knew that worry is spiritually toxic. Now, to help us gauge whether or not we are self-sufficient warriors or Christ-sufficient believers, we looked at a profile of each and asked ourselves where we fit the best. So here is the profile of the self-sufficient person. When we're self-sufficient, here's what we say. Number one, in the things we can control, we have insecurity. Self-sufficiency means that you have to protect the borders of your kingdom, and you see everyone else as a threat. And number two, in the things we can't control, we have stress. You see, if you're self-sufficient, not being in control is hard because you're all that you've got. And number three, when things break down, we have panic. The bottom line here is that when we are self-sufficient, our hope is in the wrong thing, which means that when things go wrong, we kind of have no other choice but to panic. Now here's the profile of the Christ-sufficient. Number one, in the things we can control, we have diligence. You see, being Christ-sufficient doesn't mean that we're lazy. It means that we do everything to please God. Number two, in the things we can't control, we have surrender. You see, a Christ-sufficient person is diligent with what they can control, but they trust God with the rest. This is what it means to surrender. And finally, number three, when things break down, we have faith. This doesn't mean that we are immune to suffering and pain as Christians. It just means that we have a firm hope anchored in our belief that God will make all things right again. And so the question is this: how do we stop worrying? How do we become Christ-sufficient people? The answer lies in our backpack. Remember, we all come into the world with a backpack on. We talked about this on Sunday. And over time, it gets full of life's troubles. And so the key is to put everything you can't control on the table of surrender and in faith entrust it to Jesus. You see, Jesus conquered sin and death, so we can know that no matter what happens in the end, Christ will win. That's why at the end of the day, when we put the things we can't control on the table of surrender, that's really the best place for them to be. So today we're going to talk about what worries us in life, what's in our backpack, and what we need to surrender. So let's have a meaningful discussion together. About 100 years before Paul wrote the book of Philippians, The Roman rulers sent hundreds of their soldiers there to settle after a great war. So not only did this give veterans a place to live, but it also helped ensure that this great city would remain loyal to the Roman Empire. As a result, Philippi had a large militaristic influence that likely lasted for quite some time. Now, while we can't be certain that there's a connection, it nonetheless seems striking to note here that when Paul tells the Philippians to present their requests to God, he says that God's peace will guard their hearts and minds. Now, the word that Paul uses for guard is often used in the militaristic sense of the word, as in a soldier standing guard over something. For example, in 2 Corinthians 11:32, Paul describes a time when he was a fugitive from the law, and the city went on lockdown. He uses the same word to describe the situation. He says, "When I was in Damascus, the governor under King Aretas kept guards at the city gates to catch me." Now, what this seems to suggest is that the word Paul uses in Philippians 4 does not simply mean that when we present our requests to God, we will simply have the absence of conflict. Rather, God will take an active role in protecting our hearts from the forces that cause us to worry, just like a soldier standing guard. This is the kind of peace that God promises. Now, this might seem a little far-fetched to some, but all I can say is that personally, this has been a powerful reality in my life. There have been times where I've been worrying about something until I consciously choose to put it on the table of surrender. It's remarkable to feel the worry slowly melt away. You see, there is something powerful in surrender. I suspect that many of us have things that we could surrender today, and so we're going to discuss that now as a group. Remember, worry is spiritually toxic, so don't miss out on the freedom that comes from presenting our requests to God.